It was a cold, rainy night when Daniel spotted something small trembling under his truck. At first he thought it was a mouse, until it let out the faintest whimper. A tiny white puppy, no bigger than his palm, lay there shivering, soaked and barely breathing. He scooped it up, wrapped it in his jacket, and whispered, "You're safe now, little one." But months later, that innocent rescue would turn into the most unbelievable discovery of his life. The puppy he raised, fed, and loved wasn't a dog at all. What it really was would leave scientists speechless. Stay till the end. This story will blow your mind. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The rain came down in icy sheets, drumming against Daniel's windshield as he drove along the lonely country road. It was almost midnight, and the storm had turned the world into a blur of gray and water. He was exhausted after a long shift at the lumber mill, dreaming only of warmth and sleep. But then out of the corner of his eye, something small moved under the flickering streetlight, a faint, trembling shape near the edge of the road. At first, he thought it was a leaf caught in the wind, but when his headlights passed over it, he saw a tiny body, drenched and motionless. Daniel's heart lurched. He pulled over, stepping into the cold rain, his boots splashing through puddles. As he crouched down, he realized it was a newborn puppy, barely the size of his palm, pure white, eyes sealed shut, its breathing faint and uneven. Hey, easy there," he whispered, scooping the fragile creature into his hands. Its body was freezing, its tiny heartbeat fluttering weakly against his palm. Daniel quickly tucked it inside his jacket, shielding it from the wind. He could feel it trembling, so small and helpless it barely seemed alive. When he reached home, he rushed to prepare a soft towel in a box near the heater. The puppy whimpered faintly, curling into the warmth like it finally felt safe. Daniel found himself smiling despite the storm raging outside. "You're a tough little one," he murmured. "You're gonna make it." He didn't know why he cared so much. He'd never owned a pet, never planned to. But something about that tiny life stirred something deep inside him, a quiet need to protect it. As thunder rolled across the sky, Daniel sat beside the box, watching the fragile creature breathe. He had no idea that this simple act of kindness, this stormy night rescue, would change everything, because the tiny puppy sleeping in his palm wasn't what it seemed. And one day, it would leave him questioning everything he knew about life itself. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world damp and silent. Sunlight filtered weakly through Daniel's window, glinting off the small box near the heater. He rubbed his eyes, half asleep, then froze. The tiny white puppy was still breathing, slow but steady. Relief washed over him. He hadn't expected it to survive the night. He carefully lifted the fragile creature into his hand. Its fur, now dry, felt like soft velvet against his skin. It gave a faint twitch, a sound so tiny it was almost a sigh. "You made it," Daniel whispered with a tired smile. "You really made it." He warmed a little milk on the stove, then used a cloth to gently feed the puppy drop by drop. It struggled at first, its tiny mouth barely opening, but soon began to suckle weakly. Each breath seemed like a victory. Hours passed as Daniel repeated the same process, feeding, drying, comforting. His living room smelled faintly of milk and damp fabric, but he didn't care. By nightfall, the puppy had begun to move more, curling into his hand for warmth. Daniel lined the box with a piece of his old flannel shirt, watching as it settled into the fabric, eyes still closed but body relaxed. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a strange peace. When he turned off the lights, he hesitated at the door, glancing back at the box. The puppy stirred faintly, letting out a small, almost human-like sigh. Daniel smiled. "Sleep well, little fighter." That night he dreamed of a snowy field under a pale moon and a faint glow moving in the distance. Small, white, and alive. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him this rescue was far from ordinary. Morning light spilled across the living room, warming the wooden floor where the little box sat. Daniel crouched beside it, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, and smiled as the tiny white puppy lifted its head for the first time. Its eyes were still sealed shut, but its small nose twitched in curiosity, sniffing the air as if memorizing the scent of its new home. "You're getting stronger," Daniel murmured. The puppy yawned, a sound so soft it melted something in him. He gently lifted it, feeling its tiny paws press against his palm. The once cold little creature now radiated warmth, a heartbeat steady and alive. For the next few days, Daniel built a quiet routine around it. Every morning he'd heat milk, feed it drop by drop, and then place it against his chest to keep it warm. At night he'd leave the lamp on dim, afraid darkness might somehow make it weaker. The puppy had become his silent companion, its soft breathing filling the empty house that had long echoed with loneliness. By the end of the week, its eyes finally opened, small, almond-shaped, and startlingly bright. Daniel froze, noticing how they shimmered almost silver under the light. "Well, that's new," he whispered with a grin. "Guess you need a name, huh?" He looked outside, where sunlight reflected off a fresh blanket of snow from the night before. Everything was white, calm, and quiet. He looked back at the puppy nestled in his palm and smiled. "Snowy," he said softly. "That's what I'll call you." The puppy tilted its head, letting out a faint squeak, and as if agreeing. Daniel chuckled. From that moment on, Snowy wasn't just a rescue, he was family. Weeks passed, and Snowy grew faster than Daniel could believe. What started as a palm-sized newborn was now a lively, curious creature that followed him everywhere, from the kitchen to the porch and even to the workshop behind the house. But the growth wasn't just quick, it was unusual. By the end of the first month, Snowy was already the size of a 6-month-old pup. At first, Daniel brushed it off, assuming good care and nutrition were to thank. But as days went on, he noticed details that didn't sit right. Snowy's fur shimmered faintly under certain lights, almost as if it reflected more than it should, and those silvery eyes. They didn't seem to settle on one color, sometimes gray, sometimes blue, sometimes glowing faint gold under the moonlight. One evening, Daniel sat by the fireplace watching Snowy chew on an old towel. "You're growing too fast, buddy," he said softly. Snowy paused and looked up, tilting his head with eerie understanding. There was an intelligence in that gaze that startled Daniel. It felt like the animal understood every word. Then came the night that truly unsettled him. Daniel woke suddenly to a sound outside and a soft, low growl. He grabbed his flashlight and went to the porch. Snowy stood there in the rain, fur wet and gleaming, staring at something in the darkness. But when Daniel pointed the light, there was nothing there, just the sound of rustling leaves. Snowy's stance was tense, protective, like he was guarding Daniel from something unseen. Later that night, as Daniel tried to sleep, he heard faint scratching under the floorboards, followed by a strange humming sound. Snowy whimpered, but not out of fear, more like recognition. Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't know what it was, but deep down, he sensed something was beginning to change. Snowy wasn't just growing, he was becoming something else. It was just past midnight when Daniel first heard it, a sound so strange it froze him in place. He had been half asleep on the couch, the soft crackle of the fireplace lulling him, when Snowy suddenly sat upright, ears twitching toward the window. Then came the noise, not quite a bark, not quite a growl. It was long, haunting, and almost melodic, like a song carried by the wind. Daniel blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. "Snowy?" he whispered, sitting up. The pup tilted his head, then lifted his muzzle again and released another low, trembling howl. Soft at first, then deep and resonant, vibrating through the room. It wasn't the sound of fear, it was calling. Daniel's skin prickled. He'd owned dogs before as a kid. He knew howls, yips, and whines. But this was different. It felt alive in a way that stirred something ancient in the air. The hair on his arm stood up. The sound almost carried emotion, loneliness, longing, maybe even grief. Snowy stopped suddenly and turned to face him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. Those silver eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, catching every flicker of the fire. "What are you trying to say, buddy?" he murmured, half afraid of the answer. Outside, the forest beyond his house was silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. As if the world itself was listening. Then in the distance, faintly, something answered, a similar tone echoing through the trees. Snowy's ears perked up. He whined softly, pressing closer to the window. Daniel's pulse quickened. "It's just another animal," he told himself, though he didn't believe it. Snowy stayed by the window all night, staring into the dark woods, his tail still and his body alert. Whatever had answered his howl wasn't far. By the next week, people in Daniel's small mountain town had begun to notice Snowy. At first, it was just friendly curiosity. The old lady from across the street smiled at him during walks, and kids pointed, calling, "What a pretty dog." But the more Snowy grew, the stranger the reactions became. He was larger now, almost too large for his age, his white coat gleaming unnaturally bright even under cloudy skies. When sunlight hit him, it wasn't just reflection. It was almost like his fur absorbed the light. One morning, as Daniel passed the grocery store, a man leaning against a truck called out, "That's one strange-looking husky you've got there." His tone wasn't friendly. "What breed is he?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm not sure. Found him during a storm," the man squinted. "You sure it's a dog?" The question lingered heavier than Daniel wanted to admit. That night he replayed it in his mind as Snowy lay curled beside the fireplace, eyes half closed but alert. Every sound outside, on rustling leaves, a snapping branch, and made him twitch. Rumors began spreading. Someone claimed they'd seen Snowy out late one evening, standing at the edge of the woods staring into the trees with eyes that glowed. Another neighbor swore he'd heard strange cries echoing near Daniel's property. Not human, not animal, something in between. Even children grew cautious, whispering stories of the white ghost dog that appeared on foggy nights. Daniel tried to ignore it all, but he couldn't deny the unease creeping through him. Snowy was loyal, gentle, and obedient. Yet there were moments when he'd freeze suddenly, ears erect as if hearing something distant, something no one else could. One evening, Daniel looked out the window and saw Snowy sitting in the yard, staring toward the forest again and completely still. His silver eyes reflected the moonlight like twin mirrors. Whatever was calling him from the woods, it hadn't stopped. The next morning, Daniel finally decided to take Snowy to the vet. The strange growth, the glowing eyes, the restless nights, he couldn't ignore them anymore. Snowy sat quietly in the truck's passenger seat, gazing out the window as the forest rolled by. The early fog hung low over the road, giving everything an eerie calm. Dr. Harris, the town's only veterinarian, had known Daniel for years. "Haven't seen you in ages," he said with a smile as Daniel entered the clinic. "And who's this handsome boy?" Daniel forced a grin. "This is Snowy. Found him during a storm a few months back." Dr. Harris crouched to examine him. "He's beautiful, but unusual." He ran a gentle hand along Snowy's spine, his brows furrowing. "His muscle development is advanced, and more than it should be for his age." He checked the eyes, ears, and teeth, frowning slightly. "And his pupils. They're not fully canine." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" The vet hesitated. "Could be a genetic mutation or maybe hybrid lineage." He took a small blood sample, promising to call when results came in. Snowy didn't flinch, just stared at the vet with calm, watchful eyes. When they left the clinic, the sky had darkened. Rain clouds gathered again and thunder rumbled in the distance. Snowy pressed close to Daniel's leg, tail low but eyes sharp, scanning the tree line. That night, Daniel couldn't shake the vet's words. Hybrid lineage of what? Snowy wasn't aggressive, wasn't wild. If anything, he was more intelligent, almost human in his responses. When Daniel turned off the light to sleep, Snowy moved closer, resting his head on Daniel's foot like always. Around midnight, Daniel's phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Harris. "Call me first thing tomorrow." The blood results don't make sense. Daniel frowned, staring at the screen. Snowy lifted his head, silver eyes glinting in the dark as if he, too, understood something had changed. Outside, lightning flashed, and for a brief second, Daniel thought he saw two glowing shapes standing deep among the trees. Watching his house in silence, he blinked. They were gone. But the feeling lingered. Snowy wasn't the only one out there. Daniel arrived at the clinic early the next morning, his heart heavy with unease. The clouds hung low and the air smelled of rain again, the kind of morning that made the world feel suspended in time. Dr. Harris was waiting for him in his office, arms crossed, eyes serious. He didn't even bother with small talk. "Daniel," he began slowly, "I've been doing this for 20 years, but I've never seen results like these." He turned the monitor toward him. "This isn't normal canine blood. The DNA structure, it's not fully identifiable." Daniel frowned, trying to make sense of it. "Not identifiable? You mean it's some rare breed?" The vet shook his head. "No, I ran it through every database I have. It's only 60% compatible with any known species. The rest doesn't match anything on record." Daniel's pulse quickened. So what are you saying? That he's not a dog? Dr. Harris hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't know what he is, but his blood cells regenerate at an alarming rate. His muscle enzymes are hyperactive. And there's something else. The sample reacted strangely under ultraviolet light. He clicked a button showing Daniel a photo. The sample glowed faint blue as though it were alive. Daniel sat frozen. That's impossible. I thought so too, the vet muttered. But whatever he is, he's not dangerous, at least not to you. You said he's protective. Daniel nodded silently. Then maybe, the vet said quietly. He trusts you for a reason. Driving home, Daniel's thoughts were a storm. He kept glancing at Snowy, who sat calmly beside him, eyes half closed, almost serene. How could something so gentle carry such mystery inside it? That night, as rain returned and thunder rolled over the hills, Daniel noticed Snowy pacing near the window again. Every flash of lightning illuminated his form, taller, stronger, and now glowing faintly along the edges of his fur. Daniel whispered, "What are you, Snowy?" Snowy turned his head slowly, silver eyes reflecting the storm outside. And for a brief second, Daniel saw it. Not fear, not confusion, but intelligence staring right back at him. Whatever Snowy was, he knew. The following nights were unlike any Daniel had ever experienced. The quiet rhythm of his home, the ticking clock, the hum of the heater, the distant croak of frogs was replaced by unease. Snowy had grown restless, pacing through the house as if waiting for something. His once playful energy was now cautious, alert. One evening, Daniel noticed Snowy standing in the hallway, ears perked, staring toward the front door. His posture was stiff, every muscle tensed. Then, without warning, he released a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a hum. It wasn't aggressive, but deliberate, like he was communicating. Daniel followed his gaze, but saw nothing outside except the wind stirring fallen leaves. "It's okay, boy," he said softly, but Snowy didn't move. His eyes glowed faintly again, silver and alive. That night, Daniel was awakened by strange noises from the backyard, metal clinking, followed by a faint, pulse-like vibration through the walls. Snowy bolted upright, teeth bared, tail straight. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and stepped out cautiously. The air was unnaturally still. In the middle of the yard, the soil looked disturbed, as if something had been buried or unearthed. Snowy stood over the spot, pawing at it anxiously. Daniel knelt beside him and dug with his hands, uncovering a small piece of metal no larger than a coin. It was smooth, engraved with unfamiliar markings that shimmered faintly under the light. Snowy sniffed it once and then backed away, whining. His fur bristled as he looked toward the forest again, a low rumble forming deep in his chest. Daniel's hand trembled. "Where did this come from?" he whispered. Before he could examine it further, a sharp flash of light streaked across the tree line, quick, silent, and blindingly white. Snowy barked, but it wasn't out of fear. It was a warning. Moments later, everything went still again. No wind, no sound, only Snowy's steady breathing beside him. Daniel stared at the strange metal in his hand, the glowing patterns fading slowly. A chill ran down his spine. Whatever Snowy was connected to, it was out there watching, and now it knew he'd found it. The next morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the small piece of metal lying in front of him. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching its surface and revealing faint shifting lines, like circuitry alive beneath the metal. He rubbed his temples, exhausted. Every logical part of him wanted to call someone. Maybe Dr. Harris, maybe the police, but what would he even say? That his dog had led him to an artifact glowing under moonlight? Snowy lay beside him, eyes calm but unblinking, watching Daniel as if waiting for a decision. There was intelligence in those eyes, something almost human. Daniel had never felt so torn. He picked up the metal again. It was warm, almost pulsing. "Snowy," he muttered. "What are you trying to tell me?" The dog tilted his head slightly, then stood, walking toward the window that faced the forest. He gave a soft whine and looked back, urging Daniel to follow. But fear rooted him in place. The woods had always been peaceful, but now they felt foreign, haunted by something unseen. What if there were more of these objects out there? What if whatever Snowy was connected to came looking for him next? The phone rang suddenly, breaking his thoughts. It was Dr. Harris. Daniel, listen to me carefully, the vet said, his voice low. That blood sample? It wasn't just abnormal. It reacted to electromagnetic frequencies. That's not natural. You need to keep that animal safe. And whatever you do, don't hand him over to anyone. Daniel's pulse quickened. Anyone? What do you mean? The line went dead. Snowy began pacing again, restless. Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping the strange object. Deep down he already knew. Something far bigger than him was unfolding. For the first time, he looked at Snowy not as a pet, but as a mystery fate had placed in his hands, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth. The storm came without warning that night, violent, electric, and loud enough to shake the windows. Daniel sat near the fireplace, staring into the flickering light while Snowy paced back and forth, restless as ever. Every flash of lightning made the dog's silver eyes glint like polished glass. He wasn't afraid of the thunder. If anything, he seemed charged by it. Then, at the height of the storm, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness. Daniel groaned, grabbing a flashlight, but before he could switch it on, a low humming filled the air. Deep, rhythmic, almost mechanical. The sound seemed to come from the strange piece of metal lying on the table. Snowy froze. Ears perked. His fur began to shimmer faintly, strands catching the faint blue hue pulsing from the object. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Snowy, he whispered. Without warning, the dog turned toward the door, barking once, sharp and commanding. Then he ran out into the rain. Daniel shouted his name and followed, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the storm-soaked yard. In the middle of the clearing, Snowy stood rigid, facing the trees. Lightning struck nearby, illuminating the entire scene, and for a brief instant Daniel saw shapes among the shadows. Tall, indistinct figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Snowy lifted his head and released that same haunting howl Daniel had heard once before. But this time, it wasn't lonely. It was powerful, resonant, almost summoning. The metal object in Daniel's pocket began to vibrate violently, glowing the same soft blue as Snowy's fur. A deafening crack split the sky, and a blast of wind knocked Daniel backward. When he opened his eyes, the glow was gone. The rain had stopped. Snowy stood beside him, calm and steady, his fur no longer shimmering. He looked different now, larger, stronger, his gaze wiser somehow. Daniel sat up slowly, heart pounding. What just happened? He whispered. Snowy simply walked back to him and pressed his nose against Daniel's hand, a reassuring gesture. It was in that moment Daniel realized something had changed, not just in Snowy but in everything around them. Whatever Snowy truly was, it had just awakened. The next morning, Daniel woke to an unnatural silence. The storm had cleared, leaving the world washed clean, but the air outside still carried a strange hum, faint, almost imperceptible. Snowy lay near the door, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. His fur no longer glowed, yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had happened during the night. A sudden knock jolted him from his thoughts. When he opened the door, Dr. Harris stood there, pale and uneasy, clutching a folder. "We need to talk," he said quickly. "May I come in?" Daniel nodded and led him inside. The vet placed the folder on the table, his hands trembling slightly. Inside were printed charts and photos, DNA strands, blood cell scans, glowing microscopic images. "I ran additional tests last night," Dr. Harris began. "And I sent your sample to a research contact at the university. He called me this morning, said what you have here isn't just a genetic anomaly." He hesitated, eyes darting toward Snowy. "This is something we've never seen before?" Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Harris sighed. "His DNA contains unidentified sequences, patterns that don't occur in nature. They're designed, artificial." Daniel blinked. "You're saying he was made?" "Not by any conventional means," Harris said gravely. "And there's more. Those frequencies his blood reacted to, they match an unclassified electromagnetic signal, one that was recorded years ago during a failed research experiment." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "Are you saying my dog is some kind of experiment?" The vet looked down. "Possibly something beyond that." Before Daniel could respond, Snowy stood, his ears twitching. A low hum vibrated through the air again, faint but distinct. The strange metal object on the counter began to glow softly once more. Dr. Harris froze. "That signal," he whispered. "It's responding to him." Snowy stepped closer, eyes bright with awareness. The glow from the metal intensified until the whole room shimmered in blue light. Daniel's breath caught. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was looking at his dog or at the beginning of something far bigger than himself. By the next day, Daniel's quiet home no longer felt like his own. Strange cars began appearing at the end of his dirt road, black SUVs that idled too long, windows tinted too dark. Men in plain suits came by asking questions about an animal matching Snowy's description. They flashed credentials Daniel didn't recognize, some federal, some scientific, all unsettling. The first man spoke politely, almost rehearsed. "We're from a government research division, Mr. Cole. We understand you've come into possession of a unique specimen." Daniel's jaw tightened. "He's not a specimen. He's my dog," the man smiled thinly. "Of course. But for your safety, and his, we'd like to take him for evaluation." Snowy, sitting beside Daniel, let out a low, warning growl. The man's eyes flicked toward him nervously before regaining his composure. "You have to understand, animals like this don't just appear. They're made. Someone out there may be looking for it." Daniel shut the door without another word. His heart pounded as he leaned against it. Through the window, he saw the men exchanging glances before finally driving off. That night, he called Dr. Harris, but the vet didn't answer. Instead, a voicemail played, one that made Daniel's stomach twist. "Daniel, they came to see me too. Don't trust them. Whatever Snowy is, it's not government properties. It's something they can't control. Be careful." Static cut the message short. Daniel turned toward Snowy, who was pacing again, ears alert. He knelt down, resting a hand on his fur. "They want to take you," he whispered. "But I won't let them." Snowy pressed his head against Daniel's chest as if understanding. In that silent moment, man and creature shared the same realization. Running was no longer a choice. It was survival. The night air was thick with tension. Daniel's cabin lights were off, his truck hidden behind the shed. From the window, he could see headlights glinting faintly at the edge of the forest road. The men were back. This time they weren't here to talk. Snowy stood by the door, silent but alert, his fur rising slightly as if sensing the danger closing in. Daniel's heart ached. He'd spent months raising this creature, watching it grow, learning its quiet habits. And now he was being forced to make an impossible choice. He crouched down, gripping Snowy's face gently in both hands. "They won't stop until they find you," he whispered, voice breaking. "If you stay, they'll take you apart to understand what you are. But out there," he glanced toward the forest. "Out there you'll be free." Snowy's silver eyes glimmered under the dim moonlight. He pressed his nose against Daniel's cheek, a soft, human-like gesture that shattered what little resolve Daniel had left. Tears stung his eyes. "You saved me more than once, buddy," he said. "Now it's my turn." He reached for the back door and opened it slowly. The cool wind swept through the cabin, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. Outside, the forest loomed dark and endless, whispering with the movement of unseen life. Snowy hesitated for only a moment before stepping out into the night. His coat shimmered faintly once more, catching the moonlight in silvery waves. Daniel followed him to the clearing, stopping near the edge. He wanted to say something more, but words felt too small for the weight of goodbye. Instead, he placed the metal object on the ground beside Snowy. "Take it," he murmured. "It's yours." Snowy looked back one last time, his gaze filled with an emotion Daniel couldn't define. Gratitude, sorrow, maybe even love. Then, with a powerful bound, he disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. Daniel stood there long after the sound of footsteps faded. The forest was quiet again, but something deep inside him felt forever changed. He had set Snowy free, and in doing so, had lost a part of himself he'd never get back. Months passed, and winter quietly returned to the mountains. Daniel's cabin, once filled with the sound of paws and soft breathing, now echoed with silence. He still caught himself setting out an extra bowl of food, still turned his head when a branch snapped outside, half expecting to see Snowy waiting at the door. But the forest remained still. He tried to move on. The government agents had stopped coming, the rumors faded, and life settled into a dull rhythm. Yet sometimes, late at night, Daniel would step onto the porch and stare into the woods, whispering, "I hope you made it, boy." The wind never answered. But deep down he always felt watched, not in fear, but in quiet reassurance. Then, one cold morning as the first snow began to fall, Daniel found tracks in the yard, large, deep paw prints unlike any he'd seen before. His breath caught. They led from the forest straight to his porch, and then stopped. He followed the trail with trembling hands, scanning the trees. That's when he saw it. Between the snow-laden branches stood Snowy, taller now, majestic, his fur gleaming with faint light that shimmered like liquid silver. But he wasn't alone. At his side were two smaller creatures, their coats just as bright, their eyes the same metallic glow. Daniel's knees nearly gave out. "Snowy," he whispered, voice cracking. The creature stepped closer, his movements graceful, almost ethereal. One of the smaller ones, a pup, bounded forward, curious, sniffing the air near Daniel before retreating to Snowy's side. Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he realized the truth. Snowy hadn't just survived. He'd found others, and maybe his kind, maybe his offspring. Whatever he was, he had finally found where he belonged. Snowy looked at Daniel one last time. No sound, no words, just a long, silent gaze that said everything. Then, as the wind carried fresh snow across the clearing, he turned and vanished into the white, the pups following close behind. Daniel stood there until the tracks disappeared beneath the falling snow. He smiled faintly, whispering to the quiet forest, "Goodbye, my friend." And though the woods were silent, he could have sworn he heard that soft, haunting howl one last time, echoing through the hills like a promise that he was never truly gone.